Okay, so this talk is about US income inequality and what we know about it. It's kind of a survey of a whole bunch of papers in the literature. I waffled for a long time about whether or not to have this lecture. In some view, judging from the discussion comments, I think the class would be behooved by it because it's an interesting topic that some of you seem to be particularly interested in. So I'll talk about US income inequality and what we know. It's obviously applicable to other countries, and I'm going to have more of an opinion. Let me tell you my opinion up front. Just like the UBI lecture, my general opinion is that income inequality has risen. The reasons for its rising are partly unknown, and there's large dispute over how much it has risen and how much we should be concerned about this. So I think the zeitgeist is to say this is a big deal, we need to panic about this. And I think my thoughts on it are to slow down and say, how bad is it, and how much has our system mitigated it? My claim is going to be, this is Bruce Meyer's claim really, that it's mitigated it quite a bit. So I'm not going to stand athwart history yelling stop, but I'm going to stand athwart the zeitgeist saying, on one hand and on the other hand, which I think is the proper role of an economist. So it's just a warning that I'm not going to be gung-ho on one side or another. So I'm going to talk about income inequality. What am I not going to talk about? I'm not going to talk about, even though they're super important, potentially, gender inequality, racial inequality, early childhood development, specific changes in the tax code or pass-through entities. I'll talk about that a little bit maybe. Non-monetary forms of inequality. So this is like, there's inequality in suicide, in prestige, in rates of going to prison. There's inequality in sex. So the inequality in sex is as dire as reported having of sex is as dire as the inequality of wealth, right? The top 3% of sex havers have something like 30 or 40% of the report having 30 or 40% of the sex. The next 7% have something like 30% of the sex. So as a consequence, the top 10% of sex havers control 75-ish% of the sex. Where in the United States, where this is just, I say this kind of as almost as a joke, but it's down there. It's at the base part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but we don't talk about it. And I'm not going to talk about it here either. But it's potentially important. There's inequality in marriage rates, which for people for whom that's important, that's a significant inequality. We're not going to talk about any of those, even though they're potentially important. So I'm going to kind of break down this lecture into 4 sub-questions. What's happened to income inequality? Why has it happened? What can and can't be done about it? And should we care? Sorry, it takes a while. I grabbed this, but it's like a high quality PNG, so it takes forever to load. So, and again, I apologize to the people who want me to concentrate, less on labor econ. So this is from Occupy Wall Street, which you may or may not remember. They say this is an infographic. If U.S. land mass were divided by like U.S. wealth, 1% would own this chunk, 9% would own this chunk. So the top 10% would own something like 70% of the country, 30% would own essentially most of the remainder, 20% would own this, and 40% would own this red dot. Deeply troubling, right? But we're not going to talk about wealth, and it's worth understanding why we're not going to talk about wealth, why we're going to talk about income inequality instead of wealth inequality. And it's worth knowing that wealth inequality is, if you want to make a splash with statistics, you talk about wealth inequality. But I think it's the wrong thing to think about. Because what we care about is long-run purchasing power. I don't care what Bill Gates can buy one time. I care compared to Trevor, especially if I'm comparing Trevor's income to Bill Gates' wealth. Wealth is a stock, Trevor's income is a flow. I care about my flow purchasing power against his flow purchasing power. And so, that's the whole story. Wealth may generate a flow of income that he can do. So if we're talking about, Bill Gates can corrupt the political process, he may be able to corrupt, if he has $50 billion, he may be able to corrupt the political process once for $50 billion. What I really care about is and then be done, then he would be bankrupt. What I really care about is year in, year out, what's a reasonable level at which he will corrupt the political process. It's going to be related to his income, not his wealth, right? So income is going to reflect the permanent influence of wealth. So we really want to care about what happens to income, not to wealth. We can talk about that. Feel free to bring that up in discussion. And just to be clear, while wealth inequality is quite stark, as we saw in the Occupy Wall Street infographic, income inequality is far less stark. So just to be clear, the reason 40% own this red dot is because they have zero measured wealth. So, you know, sometimes you'll read, oh, the top 6 or top 100 Britons, Oxfam loves to come out with these studies, top 6 Britons or top 100 Britons own more wealth than the bottom 3 billion people in the world. This is, you know, a shock statistic. Maybe you should be concerned, but I have more wealth than the bottom 3 billion if they all have zero. And so it's easy to come up with a lot of zeros. I do not have as much income as the bottom 3 billion. They may have zero wealth, but they have significant income. And so just by the very nature of the thing, income inequality is far less stark than wealth inequality, and it's the thing we should potentially care about. We'll talk more about what we should care about. Maybe we care about different things for different purposes. Bring it up in the discussions if I don't cover it. But broadly, what's happened to income inequality over time in the United States? So the idea is going to be the bottom 50% in the United States have lost a lot of ground in terms of the fraction of the income that they have control of. And it's primarily the bottom 25% that have lost that. The next 40%, so I'm going to break things up into 4 groups typically. The bottom 50%, you can think of these as the poor. The next 40%, these are people who are typically in and out of poverty programs. The next 40%, the 50th to 90th percentile, you could think of this as the working middle class, have lost a little bit of ground. The next 9%, you can think about this like the professional class, a lot of the professional class, doctors, professors, dentists, stuff like that, will have gained a little bit of ground. And the top 1% have gained a lot. So as we'll see this in graphic form, but it's really the actions happening on the bottom 50% and the top 1%. And the income, we're also going to show the income distribution is becoming more right skewed. Most of this has happened since 1980. So just to give you an idea of what are people so concerned about when they talk about income inequality. This is from the World Inequality Database. This is Emmanuel Saez and Gabrielle Zuckman among other co-authors at UC Berkeley, have created a data set that I've talked about in the discussion comments a little bit that try and measure income inequality across each country, all over the world over time. Ambitious and bold undertaking, incredibly useful. I'm going to use their numbers. There's reason to think that they overstate the increase in income inequality, which I'm not going to talk about too much because it seems like we could talk about in discussion comments if you want. But I'm going to take their numbers as given in this, just to say, what are people worried about? Well, as you see, what happened to it used to be the top 1% had about 12% of income, and the bottom 50% had about 20% of income, right? Since 1980, the top 1%'s income share has almost doubled, and the bottom 50%'s income share has not quite halved, but went down by 40% or something like that, 35%. So this is what people are concerned about. It used to be the top 1% had way less purchasing power. So put it this way, if the bottom 50% were giving 1% of their money to a political candidate, and the top 1% were giving 1% to the political candidate, the bottom 50% would outspend the top 1%, doubling. All the Oprahs, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates had less purchasing power in terms of their income than the bottom 50%. That is largely no longer true, at least according to this. And that's what people are concerned about, right? The top 1% have more purchasing power than the bottom 50%. Just to put it all in context, though, because it's worth putting in context. This is worrying. But if you're worried about the fate of democracy, it's worth noting that the 50th to 90th percentile, so those 40% of people, used to have something like 45% of the income. Now they have 41% of the income. Their income share has declined a little bit, as I said, but they are still larger, almost larger than any 2 other groups, essentially as large as any 2 other groups. So that healthy middle class, not even the professional class, that healthy middle class, the 50th to 90th percentile, still have significant chunk, far more, for instance, more than double the top 1%. And so if they give 1% of their income, they're going to dwarf any other, group, such as the top 1%, the bottom 50%, or the professional class, which has gained a little bit. It used to be at 4%, now it's 27%, something like that. So that's the story. They don't have data all the way up to 100 because it takes time to, all the way up to 2020 because it takes time to get it all. Okay, so this is what people are concerned about, this cross. I say one should note that in context, democracy hasn't completely eroded yet. There's reason to think the middle class, which are these guys I think of, and partly these guys, are far larger than any other group combined. Okay, great. It's also the case that what else has happened to income inequality? So the top 1% seem to have gained, the bottom 50% seems to have lost. We want to understand that. It's also the case that I'm talking about the top 1%, but even within the top 1%, things are going to become skewed. So this is the gain in pre-tax income over time. We'll talk about post-tax in case you're curious. In pre-tax income, it looks like the bottom 10th percentile has gained only a little bit since 1960. This is in real terms. The middle 25% has gained a bit. The 90th percentile has more than doubled their wealth. The top 1% has, quite a bit more than doubled their wealth. But the point is, this is going to create a distribution that's even more skewed than it was before. The top 1% gained a lot. The next 10% gained a bit, and the bottom didn't move very much at all. So this is going to create a more of a skewed distribution of income. It's even more true. So that's just if you want numbers, because it's sometimes hard to think about numbers. Since 1980, the bottom 10th percentile have actually lost. So I'm going to show you numbers from 1980 onward. In 1980, they used to have about $8,000 in real terms. Now they have about $6,000. The 25th percentile hasn't changed much at all. The 50th percentile has gained a little, $4,000 or something. And the 99th percentile has gained precipitously. That's just to put numbers on it in case you wanted to see it. Now, all the numbers I'm using are taking a household and splitting it among adults in the household. So if a two-person household made $2 million, I would say each person is going to get $1 million. It's $1 million per person in the household. There are different ways of doing that. I could have said, what's the income inequality by household? This is kind of income inequality by person, splitting the household among adults. It's not going to do great violence to any of our points. Now, I said the income distribution is becoming more skewed, but if we zoom in on that top 1%, what's happening in that top 1%? It's gaining on average, 250% since 1960. Well, if you look at the bottom half of the top 1%, those poor suckers have only, doubled or whatever, more than doubled. 100% would be doubling. So 200 increased by a factor of 2 their income. The next 40% of that half, so 99.5% to 99.9% have, have had a twofold increase. 99.9% to 99.99%, and so on, have gained even more. And the top guys have not just gained 250%, they've gained 600%. So this is almost fractal in that, yes, income is more skewed, but even if you look in the top 1%, even that's very skewed. And that's going to tell us things about, if you're going to explain the increase in inequality, you have to think about this. All these guys, for instance, are experiencing the same basic tax change. And so for some of them to gain that much more than another, would be queer, right? It's hard to explain. Okay, so what are the takeaways from this little section? What's happened to wealth inequality in a fast 12 slides or whatever, 8 slides? We've seen a dramatic rise in income inequality, primarily from the loss on the bottom in terms of percentage of GDP, a loss in the bottom half and a rise in the top 1%, and then the other two guys kind of giving a little ground, the other two being the 50th to 90th percentile, the kind of middle class, and the 90th to 99th percentile, the professional class, have have not moved nearly as much as a percent of GDP. So it's really been a shifting of those two tail categories. There's been a strong increase in the right tail. We have a lot more skewness, and wealth has followed suit in terms of wealth is going to look just like this, except it's going to be far more dispersed, far more, there's a lot more inequality. So in the next section, then I'll transition to why has that happened. There's not going to be an answer. There's going to be many possible answers.